Well, if you're new, welcome. My name is Joey McLaughlin. I have the honor of being one of the pastors here. And today we hope that you feel loved, seen, wanted, and welcome, that you find a place here to belong, to become, to be discipled, and to fall in love with Jesus like never before. We are in a series of messages titled Kingdom Culture. Let me say Kingdom Culture. And we are studying Jesus' iconic, famous, powerful, world-changing Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus's manifesto. It is his vision for how you and I join him in remaking the world. 2,000 years ago, Jesus got people together on the side of a mountain, and he casted vision for what the culture of the kingdom is going to be like. This is the way that he sees humanity changing the world. And our heart is that this kingdom culture would become our culture, that it become the culture of our church, that it become the culture of our family, that it become the culture of your home, that this is what our lives would feel like and smell like and taste like and sound like, that the ways of heaven would start to invade earth, that the culture of heaven would start to become the culture of earth. And in week one, I told you that you were gonna hear the greatest sermon that had ever been preached, and then all I proceeded to do was read 3 chapters of the Bible, right? I read Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the entire Sermon on the Mount, because that whole "we are people of a book" thing isn't just something cute that we say, it's actually true. We believe that the words of God are powerful and that they breathe life into dry bones. And so in week one of this series, Kingdom Culture, we just let all of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount wash over us and saturate into us, and so that the word of God could do its work and challenge our paradigms about whether or not we want to be people who live for the things of the world, or we want to be people who live for the kingdom. And in week 2, we turned our attention to the opening lines of the Sermon on the Mount, and we looked at the beatitudes. Let me hear you say beatitudes. And these are Jesus' blessings. These are Jesus' views of the good life. And we saw that maybe some of our definitions or perceptions or conceptions of the good life are different than the good life as it's understood in the kingdom. And we learned that the culture of the kingdom is a culture of dependency. We learned that the power of the kingdom doesn't flow to those who prop themselves up, but the power of the kingdom flows to those who know they need it. And in week 2, we learned that the kingdom is available to all who really want it. That Jesus, he preaches the greatest sermon ever preached to a group of needy, poor, sick people, as to say that the kingdom comes to those who are at the end of themselves. The kingdom comes to those who are fed up with the ways of the empire, who are tired of the worldly systems, and who are done with the way of the establishment. And if you feel in your soul today that maybe I'm done with the American dream, and maybe I'm done with blending in with society, and maybe I'm done with going through the motions, and maybe I'm done with the lie that culture has sold me, then maybe what you're longing for is the kingdom. And Jesus says that all who long, all who desire can come and they can experience the culture of the kingdom. And then what's so interesting is where Jesus goes next, where Jesus goes from there. Because remember, Jesus has just pronounced blessings or congratulations on poor, hurting, broken, least likely people. And then he says to those poor people on a hillside, Matthew 5:13, "You are the salt of the earth." I want for you to hear Jesus saying that to you. You are the salt of the earth. Now, when I said that, like almost no one in this room got excited. No one was like ready to run through a brick wall because you got called salt of the earth, right? Because when we hear you are the salt of the earth, what comes into our minds is something that lives in a glass canister that sits on the table at Chili's, or Taco Mac, or La Parrilla, right? But that's what comes to our minds when we think you are the salt of the earth. It's just something ordinary. Now, I love salt, okay? Anybody else with me? Like, does anybody love, I promise you, I love salt more than you love salt, okay? I love salt. Like, if you ever have me over to your house, which you should for dinner, and don't be offended if before I ever try the food that you make me that I put salt on it, okay? Like, I don't mean no disrespect, but I want for you to know I'm salting that food, okay? There is no way that you put enough salt on it. I salt everything, okay? Like, I salt ice cream, straight up. I'll put salt in my beer. True story. If you go to a Mexican restaurant with me, here's what's gonna happen. I'm gonna get that whole thing of chip and I'm just gonna put salt on it, all right? And then I'm gonna put salt in the salsa, and then every single chip, I'm gonna put more salt on that chip. Is this true, babe? This is what I do, okay? Every single day. Most foods for me, they're just a vehicle for salt, okay? There are a lot of foods that I would never eat, but I only eat them because they're salt, okay? So like Brussels sprouts, they taste like the spawn of Satan. We all know this. Everyone knows this. But if you put some salt and vinegar on Brussels sprouts, they make you want to slap your grandma. Salt, it's the power of salt. I love salt. My kids got this disease too, okay? They got this disease. My wife is actually so concerned about my love for salt that she makes me have a pink Himalayan sea salt. Y'all know about this? It's like supposed to be the healthy salt because she's worried about me like dying in my 30s of a heart attack because of how much I love salt. And my kids, they got it too. So Joe could vouch for this. The other day, our wives went out for a birthday celebration together, and so we were left with the kids, and so that means that we had to prepare dinner, which means that we went to Waffle House for Brenner. Hello. Hallelujah. How many of you love some Brenner, a little breakfast for dinner? Praise the Lamb. And so there we were at Waffle House getting some Brenner, and my daughter, Lainey, my 2-year-old daughter, Lainey, as she was partaking in a chocolate chip waffle, grabbed the shaker of salt and started to put it on her waffle, and she ate the whole thing with salt on her waffle. So my kids have it too, so pray for my cardiologist, okay? And all of our family's cardiologists. I love salt, and yet, even for me, someone who loves salt, I don't necessarily feel this sense of extravagance when Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, but you should. You really, really should. You see, for us today, salt kind of gets like a bad rap in health circles, or like people even say like, oh bro, why you being salty? You know what I'm talking about? Where they'll like say it in a negative connotation. And so for us, salt is kind of like underestimated or undervalued or even devalued. But in the ancient world, you cannot underestimate the significance of salt. In the ancient world, the Greeks considered salt to be divine. The Mosaic law required that all offerings presented by the Israelites contain salt. Roman soldiers, I don't know if you know this or not, but Roman soldiers at times were paid their wages in salt. Have you ever heard the phrase before, oh, that person's not worth their salt? It's where it comes from. Our word salary comes from the word salt because it's this idea of value. It's this idea of currency. It's something that's extremely valuable. We see salt on every table at every restaurant, but it wasn't as easily accessible in the ancient world. And so did you know that wars were fought over salt? Because salt could be used for so many different things. We usually think about salt being used for one thing or maybe two things, but in the ancient world, and by some scholars' estimation, there are over 4,000 uses for salt. That's mind-blowing. 4,000 uses for salt. And so Jesus, when he sits on a hill and he says to these peasants who are poor and who are broken and who are hurting, and he blesses them, and then he says, you are the salt of the earth. He is ascribing incredible value to them. Jesus is looking at this average group of people, and he is making this over-the-top statement. He says, you are the salt of the earth. Now, for us, this would be like us hearing, you are the gold of the earth. You are the value of the earth. Those of you who embrace these beatitudes, who participate in the kingdom in this way, you become the salt of the earth, the value of the world. And isn't that how it works in the kingdom? The culture of the kingdom is to take those that the world doesn't value and make them valuable. The culture of the kingdom is to speak identity over those who have been forgotten, to ascribe a value to what the world has deemed worthless. That's kingdom culture. Now, there are so many potential implications that Jesus could have had in his mind when he says you're the salt of the earth. And when you study this, there's this propensity in some theologians to try to really box Jesus in. To say, Jesus was just saying this one thing or this main thing or people taking it this way or that way, but what Jesus was really trying to say was this. And as you study it, as you read commentaries or listen to preachers preach on this, they will have their own take on what Jesus meant when he said salt, and they'll usually try to back him into this is what he's talking about. But I think that Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. And he picked for his opening illustration in the Sermon on the Mount, the greatest sermon ever, something that would have an unimaginable amount of possibilities and implications for what it means for us to be the salt of the earth. So we could begin to imagine what it might look like, all the different varying ways and colors and nuances that you and I could take this kingdom culture and we could change the world. We're salt. We're salt, and I think that Jesus wants us to wrap our minds around the millions of implications that this has for us. Now, don't get me wrong, I think you can take this too far, okay? Like I've heard some preachers preach this and they take it too far, and they're like, okay, so salt is this, so you're this, and salt is this, and so you're this, and salt kills slugs, so Christians kill slugs. Weird, right? Don't do that, okay? Like, that's not a good implication. But I do think that there's so much color and so much texture that we can draw from this. So to kind of get started, the most academic or the most Jewish, if you were going to put yourself in the shoes of the people who would have been there on the mountain that day, who were very, very familiar with the Mosaic law, with the Old Testament, what would have likely come to mind for them would have been the idea of salt and its connection to the Mosaic law and sacrifices. It would have been salt's connection to the covenant. It would have been salt's connection to the Torah. In the Old Testament, we see that salt is associated with purity in Exodus 30:35, with covenant loyalty in Numbers 18:19, that it's an element to be added to sacrifices in Leviticus 2:13. And so they could have had this idea that we are God's covenant in the world, that we are the Torah or the teachings of God to the world, that we are the sacrifice for God on the world. And I believe that in Jesus' mind, when he mentioned salt, that he had that in his mind too. Look at Leviticus 2:13. Just look at the significance of salt in the Old Testament. You shall season all your grain offerings with salt. You shall not let the salt of the covenant with your God be missing from your grain offerings. With all your offerings, you shall offer salt. Numbers 18:19, salt is a forever covenant. All the holy contributions that the people of Israel present to the Lord, I give to you and to your sons and daughters with you as a perpetual due. It is a covenant of salt before the Lord, for you and for your offspring with you. In the ancient world, what they would do is if they would actually make a covenant together, the people who made a covenant to sell each other land, they would eat salt as a way of saying we've signed that deal. And God has implemented this in the Old Testament. We'll see Ezekiel 43:24, the priest sprinkles sacrifices with salt. You shall present them before the Lord, and the priest shall sprinkle salt on them and offer them up as a burnt offering to the Lord. And so I think Jesus has all that rich Jewish imagery in his mind when he says that we're salt and yet so much more. I think that he has in his mind things like, you'll hear some people say that in the first century, salt was used medicinally. It was used for medicine to heal wounds. And so you and I, as the salt of the earth, we're supposed to bring healing to the sick parts of our world. You'll hear others say that salt was used as a fertilizer. So as the salt of the earth, you and I, we create the ground where spiritual growth can happen. Like I could preach that sermon, okay? Others will say that the primary use for salt, do you know what the primary use for salt was in the first century? It's not the primary use that we would use for it today. For us today, primary use is flavor, but for them, the primary use of salt was as a preservative. In the first century, they would pack things in salt to keep them from decaying, from something becoming rotten, from it dying. This was the number one use for salt. The thing that these people use salt for every single day, who just heard that they are the salt of the earth, is to stop something from dying. If they didn't want something to die, they would pack it with salt. If they didn't want something to decay, they would pack it with salt. And so what Jesus is saying to us, what Jesus is saying to you and to me, is that we are living in a world that is full of death and that is full of decay. He is saying that society is decaying, that Values are decaying. Marriages are decaying. Churches are decaying. Morality is decaying. Honor is decaying. Goodness is decaying. And Jesus is saying to his disciples, I am trying to pack you into the earth like salt. And what my followers will do is they will keep back the decay. He's saying, I don't want the family to decay. I don't want the definition of marriage to decay. And I don't want for how the world feels about children or unborn children to decay. I want for you to keep back decay wherever you're sprinkled in. Don't let truth decay. And I think all of those things are what Jesus would have had in mind, but there is something specific that Jesus would have had in mind because of what he says next. So not only are we the medicine of the world or the fertilizer of the world or the preservative of the world, Jesus says you are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste or its flavor, how shall its saltiness be restored? Jesus focuses on the taste of salt. We know this. We know that salt brings flavor to food, that it makes bland foods better, that it enhances whatever we are eating. So come with me on this. As people who embrace kingdom culture, we're supposed to bring flavor and taste to every part of the world that we find ourselves in. We're supposed to bring out the good that is there. We're supposed to make things better when our presence is around. But let's be real. This doesn't seem to be the way that most Christians operate. Like the way that most Christians operate, you would think that like one of the beatitudes is like blessed are the bland. Like a lot of times that's what happens. Christians just become vanilla and we become safe and we become predictable and we become calculated and we become just hunkered down in our holy little huddles when we're supposed to be out there bringing salt and seasoning and flavor and life to the world that we're around. Usually, we're not the ones who are getting accused of adding flavor. We're the ones who are getting pretty accused of being boring, of being bland, right? I mean, think about how Christians get pegged in culture today. Think about the image that most of the world has of us. Do they have this image of us bringing out the good and making things better and spicing things up? Like, when's the last time that you had some friends who were getting ready to throw a party and they're like, you know what would make this party spicy if we invited our Christian friends? You know what would add some seasoning to this Friday night? Like, let's get the believers in the building and watch what happens next. But there's a way that it should work. And listen, I'm here to tell you that I went to a wedding on Friday night. And if you want, and at this wedding, all of the staff of Elevate City was invited. And if you want the dance floor to pop off at your wedding, you get Elevate City staff in the building, okay? Because it was hype, all right? So this is who we're supposed to be, church. This is kingdom culture. I'm trying to remind you of what Jesus intended for us to be as a people. We weren't intended to be boring or safe or predictable. You were supposed to be salty. You were supposed to be spicy. You were supposed to add flavor. You were supposed to bring out the good. You were supposed to be that missing ingredient that everyone longed for and that things weren't going to be worth it if you weren't involved. And I'm just reminding you today that the culture of the kingdom is salty. One very powerful thing about us being salt is that salt inevitably creates thirst. Salt inevitably creates thirst. And what we are supposed to do as the salt of the earth is we're not just supposed to be salty so that people think that we're delicious, right? That's not our MO. I mean, you've never eaten something, no matter how much salt was on it, and be like, that's some good salt. Right? You put salt on it and then you say, that's some good food. And likewise, we are salty in order to point people towards Jesus, to create thirst for Jesus in other people so that people can begin to long for him, long for their souls to be quenched and satisfied by him. This is what it means for us to be the salt of the earth. That where we are, people are like, I want to know the Jesus that you know. I want to have the Jesus that you have. Introduce me to the living water that does not run dry. This is what it means to be the salt of the earth. In order for this to happen, we're going to have to think about our lives getting sprinkled in around the world. You know that salt in a salt shaker 2 inches away from your plate of food is doing absolutely nothing? And way too many Christians are living their lives in the salt shaker. You're staying cooped up, staying tucked in there, nice and neat next to some other granulars of salt. That's what we are, right? Just a bunch of granulars of salt in the building today. But Jesus is saying, I want to take that salt and I want to sprinkle it out all over the world. And so what Jesus has in his mind is that there would be followers of Jesus at every level and in every crack and in every crevice of society. It is not right for Christians to pull out of politics. It is not right for Christians to pull out of medicine. It is not right for Christians to step out of education. It is not right for Christians to step out of business. It is not right for Christians to step out of the spaces and the spheres and the places where bland life is happening, where decay is taking place. We're supposed to be sprinkled in. We're supposed to be spread out so that the world can experience and long for the person of Jesus. If we do this, though, we're going to become a contrast society. You see, salt creates contrast. It creates this distinguished or this distinctive flavor. And sometimes that can come with some difficulties. So this is why in verse 13, Jesus says, if salt loses its saltiness, it is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. Now, there's a lot of different meanings about this. Some people think Jesus was just being funny because salt can't lose its saltiness. However, one distinction there is that the salt of the ancient world is not like the salt of today, okay? So I think I've got a picture of what it looks like to harvest salt and for them to harvest salt in parts of the world that aren't like where we live. Like we just get the thing to us, purified, created in a laboratory oftentimes, but the way that they would gather salt is they would gather it from the sea. And in the midst of it, oftentimes, different things would get mixed in with this salt. And if something got mixed in with this salt, the salt could actually become compromised. It could become diluted because there was no longer pure salt in there. And I wonder today if some of us have lost our saltiness because we become compromised by culture. And we have allowed things of the world to get into our lives in such a way that they dilute the potency of what we're supposed to bring. We've allowed things to slip or to shift or to give some there or to adopt this belief from culture. And I wonder, are we affecting America or is America affecting us? Are we affecting Atlanta or is Atlanta affecting us? Or have we allowed the saltiness that we're supposed to bring to get diluted by the things of this world? This is what Jesus is saying. He's saying, don't let your salt get compromised, because if you do, you'll just be trampled underfoot. And this is actually what would happen. They would take salt that had become diluted or compromised, and they would add it to the streets to fill in the cracks and the crevices to make a more even ground. And so for us, we're like, what a weird thing to do, just throw salt in the street. Like, what are you doing, Jesus? Is it that weird thing where you like throw salt over your shoulder? Like, what's going on? But they would actually do this. They would use salt that was wasted to form a bed of the ground, and people would just walk all over it. And isn't that what's happening today? Don't Christians just get walked all over today? Don't we just feel like, oh man, I can't step up and speak for my values? Doesn't it feel at times more challenging or difficult or embarrassing to come out as someone who holds to traditional biblical Jesus values than it does to embrace some of the wild progressive values of the world? Like think, in your place of business, would it be easier to come out as something that is in line with a progressive, worldly, cultural narrative, or to come out as somebody who loves Jesus, believes that the Bible is true, believes in the reality of heaven and hell, believes in the supernatural? Which one feels more awkward? Which one feels more uncomfortable? Because when salt loses its saltiness by trying to compromise with culture, we're no longer good for anything. If we're not different, we don't have anything to offer. If we're not different, we don't have anything to offer. And Jesus is going, don't let the salt lose its saltiness. One of the things about salt is that salt is like, it's an irritant to a certain level. It gets into things and it rubs and it disturbs, and that's part of what it means to be salt, is that your life becomes provocative, and then it makes people start to ask questions of whether or not they've really got the right way of doing life figured out. If you've ever been to Austin, Texas before, how many of you ever been to Austin, Texas before? Everything's bigger in Texas, come on. And in Austin, there's this phrase, and you'll see it all around. You'll see it on bumper stickers and billboards and hanging in the windows of businesses. Does anybody know it? It's keep Austin weird, right? Keep Austin weird. And if you've ever been there, you're like, I think you're fine. I think you've got it under control. I don't think it's changing anytime soon. Austin is very weird, but they're so proud of their weird. And they don't want to lose their weird, because they know that it is their weird that makes them unique and gives them something to offer. Do you know that about you being salt? Or are you trying to make salt not as salty? Are you trying to tone saltiness down? Hey, I'm just here today telling you that the culture of the kingdom is that we gotta stay salty, y'all. We gotta keep Christianity salty with all of its implications. The good and the challenging, the part of it that's a disturbance, and the part of it that brings flavor and life and creates thirst. We need all of it. We have to stay salty. This is the culture of the kingdom. But Jesus, he doesn't just call us the salt of the earth. He also calls us the light of the world. Matthew 5, verse 14, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Light, obviously, it provides visibility, it provides illumination, it provides clarity and exposure and transparency, it provides awareness. Light is beautiful, light is inviting, it shows the way in the dark. God's ultimate dream, we learn this from the book of Isaiah, is to have his people be a city on a hill radiating light, and other nations start to stream into it. This is what the prophet Isaiah says. He dreams that we would be his covenant people who live for the or of the Torah, the or of the Torah. So light, if you reverse engineer it, the Hebrew word for light, the word that we get our word Torah from, which is the Old Testament, the books of the Old Testament. The real word for that is or, which is where we get Torah from. So this idea of us being the light of the world is we are the Torah to the world. We are Jesus's message to the world. We are the ones who live out the Torah amongst the world. This is why God's word is a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path. And Jesus goes, what the Torah has been for you, now you become that for the world. I want for you to light the way. I want for you to show the path. I want for you to bring goodness and flourishing and a blessing and distinctiveness and to show the way. So what the Torah has done for you, you didn't know what to do, but I wrote it down in the Torah, and this has guided you. This has kept you. This has led you. And now you do that, be that, become that. You are that for the rest of the world. We are people of the light. Now, here's the thing about lights is that lights are not randomly placed. Have you noticed this? Like, if you've ever been in the middle of a home renovation before where maybe your table wasn't where like your dining room light is, and you're like walking around and you keep hitting your head on that light that's hanging. Anybody ever have? Nope, just me. Very embarrassing. Okay. Lights are strategically placed. They go in a very specific purpose. And when this building was designed, they thought about where the stage was going to be and where the lights needed to be to make sure that there was full coverage throughout the room so that lights are strategically placed. Did you know that God has strategically placed you? That according to Acts 17, that you live where you live, you have what you have. You've got the street address that you've got. You live in the neighborhood that you live in. You work at the place of business that you work at. You drive the route that you drive to work because God has strategically placed you to be a light in the dark places of this city and community. We are lights, and we have been strategically placed by the God of the universe. He calls us a city on a hill, a city on a hill. Now, in the ancient world, when you were in a desert, it's hard for us to imagine this because light is so easily accessible to us, but all that they had was the natural lights in the ancient world. So think about how precious life would be. Anybody scared of the dark? Imagine being in the desert and it's dark. And all you've got is the lights of the ancient world. So you've got the sun, you've got the moon, you've got the stars, and then you've got fire that would burn in cities. And this fire was difficult to be able to keep it going. And so what would happen is cities would be these beacons of light. And it said that in the ancient world, if you were traveling at night in the desert, you could see the city of Jerusalem from hundreds of miles away. Because that light, Jerusalem, is like, it's always the city on the hill in the Old Testament. And so Jesus is saying, hey, that light that attracts people in the desert, that guides people in the desert, that compels people in the desert. Think about walking around in the desert where there are animals and where there are robbers and where there are thieves. And then there's this city up on a hill after you've been journeying through the desert, and you see it in the distance and you know that safety is on the horizon. Jesus says, what Israel has been to the world, now you are going to be that to the world. You're going to be this light that attracts and that brings people in. Now, some scholars say that as Jesus was sitting on this mountain, that what you would have been able to see would have been the city that's the largest city in Galilee, and it's the city of Safed. And Jesus on a mountain says, hey, you are a city on a hill. And potentially he points to the city of Safed and he says, you are like that. You are elevated and lifted up. You're not meant to be hidden or to be flat. You're meant to be put in a position of prominence where people can see you and be drawn to you and be guided by you. Be like that. Light your lamp and put it on a stand, for no one would put it in a basket. No one would do that. And there's so much debate about, once again, what Jesus is doing in this moment. But Jesus is ultimately saying, he's saying that salt in salt shakers does nothing. And light under a basket does nothing. Like, can you imagine how weird that would be? If you went over to someone's house and they were like, my lamps, I don't really like them. They're kind of like, they're old. They're like circa 1997. And so the brass isn't giving off a good vibe. So I'm going to put a basket over this lamp. We're just going to sit in your living room in the dark. It'd be awkward. It'd be strange. It'd be weird. That is what Jesus is saying. It is so weird for me to light you, to put the light of life within you, and then for you to hide it or keep it to yourself. You were lit up in order to light the world up. You cannot keep this to yourself. One of the things that's really interesting about lights is that nobody looks at lights, if you've ever noticed this. Nobody ever looks at a light and goes, man, that's an awesome light. Like, none of you today have just been like staring around like, oh, that's probably like a DJ Chauvet 300. Must put out 400 lumens. I think it's gotta be 66,000 watts. That bad boy is a beaut. No one's doing that, right? A light is not designed for you to look at that light. A light is designed to shine on something else. And likewise, sometimes when we talk about this idea of being the light of the world, we're like, oh, I don't want to draw attention to myself. Good. That's not the point. The point is for you to point to the one who it's all about. Let your light shine before men that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father who is in heaven. It's all about him. It's all about pointing to him that people might know the worth and the value and the beauty of Jesus. And they're not going to know unless we shine, unless we become salt. I want to close with a story that, man, once I heard this story, I've just never been able to shake it when I think about this concept of us being the salt of the earth and us being the light of the world. There's this popular author and speaker. Her name's Christine Kane, and she is just a fireball from down under. She's from Australia, and she's on the front lines of fighting human trafficking and sexual exploitation and some of the craziest parts of the world. And Christine tells this story about coming to America with her daughter, Sophia. And one of the things that they wanted to do when they got to America was they wanted to go to Walmart. For us, we're just like, Walmart, like, what's the big deal? No big deal, but we forget about the Second Amendment, okay? And so for people from other parts of the world, they're like, I want to go somewhere where you can buy underwear, bread, and a gun. It's like an exciting thing for them. And I'm like, yeah, you can get that at Walmart. And so they're all jacked up. They're like tweeting about it. We're going to Walmart. It's going to happen. Knocking it off our bucket list. And so they go. They walk into Walmart. I'm guessing they're disappointed. I don't know. It's not all that it's cracked up to be. I took some Belgians when we had some of our Belgian missionary friends in town. They're like, can we go to Walmart? And they actually loved it. They're like, this place is huge. But so there, Christina is with her daughter Sophia, and they're in Walmart, and they're like, well, we've got to get something to be able to mark the momentous memory-making moment of us going to Walmart. And so at the time, her daughter Sophia is really into two things. She's really into Barbies, and she's really into flashlights. Well, good news, at Walmart, those things are combined. And so they're walking down the kids' aisle, and sure enough, she sees this Barbie flashlight, and she's like, Mom, because she's from Australia, you get it? Mom, can I get this Barbie flashlight? And she says, of course you can. And so she gets it, and Sophia is there waiting in line, and she's so excited about this flashlight. And so she goes, Mom, can I turn it on? Can I turn it on? And so Christine, standing in line, opens up the packaging, and she gets the batteries, and she puts it in the flashlight, and Sophia starts to shine that light. But because she's in Walmart, and it feels like you're in a dentist chair the whole time that you're in Walmart, you can't see the light from the flashlight. Because of all of these overhead fluorescent lights just lighting everything up, there's no ability for Sophia to be able to see the thing that her mom just got for her, just purchased for her, just gave her. It is useless. So Sophia utters these words that I've never forgotten. She says, hey, Mom, let's go find some darkness. And Christine said, in that moment, I knew that this was a lesson that the church needed to hear. That we were created to be the kinds of people who carry something within us, the light of the world, and that our mission is not to keep that light inside of a building or consolidated to a gathering on Sundays, but we're supposed to go find some darkness. We're supposed to go find those people who are still lost and hurt. Y'all gotta commit. You're gonna clap or you're not, okay? We're supposed to go find those people who are lost and who are searching and who are lonely. And so I wanna do this for just a second. Can you make it all go black? I want to remind you that this is what many people in your neighborhood feel like. I want to remind you today that this is what many people at your work feel like. I want to remind you today that this is what some of your siblings feel like. I want to remind you today that there are people that you know from high school or college, and this is what they feel like. They feel like they are trapped in so much darkness that the darkness is suffocating, and they're panicking, they're anxious, they're worried. Is somebody about to take my wallet? Like, what is happening? They're in darkness. And Jesus says to you and me that we are the light of the world. Have you forgotten? This is an easy message to preach, if I could be so honest, but this is a difficult message to live. But it's the one that matters. All this Jesus stuff, all these sermons, all this worship music does not matter if we keep it to ourselves. There are people who are trapped in darkness, and Jesus has strategically placed you. He has saved, called, and created you so that you could be the light. Would you light the world up? Can we light this city up? I just want to close by telling you the honor that it is in the book of Revelation. Jesus gives us this picture of the new heavens, his coming kingdom, and he says, in that kingdom, there will be no sun or moon or stars. They will all pass away because the light of the world will be the Lamb. Someday, the light, the whole world will be lit up by the glory of who Jesus is. But in this moment, in this hour, Jesus has given us the dignity, the value of being for this world now what he will someday be for this world forever. Don't forsake your calling. Don't neglect the value that has been placed upon you. You weren't saved to just be saved. You were saved to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. This is the culture of the kingdom. Jesus, we pray today, acknowledging that we live in a broken, dark, decaying, hurting, searching, lonely world. And God, I just confess that sometimes I slack on my responsibility of being the salt. And sometimes I'm really great at shining my light in the light, but I forget to go find some darkness. And I just pray that we would begin to be the kind of place, the kind of culture, the kind of church that is salty, the kind of church that is a city on a hill. That there's something about us that's so illuminating, that's so drawing, that's so attractive that people come from miles and miles and miles away to find the light of the world that we have found. Jesus, we want people to see our good works and to glorify our Father who is in heaven. Let your kingdom come. Make us uncomfortable. Make us bold. Remind us that this is the only thing that's going to matter in the end. Prayed in Jesus' name. And all God's people said, amen.